So I want to talk a little bit about how you're going to be using gradation for your projects today. Things to consider. You've all seen and practiced your value boxes, right? Where we have them divided up and you have one that's colored really dark. So you've pushed as hard as you can, or you've used like a 4B or a 6B pencil in there. And then the next one over, you can do a little lighter, and that might be moving to a 2B pencil. And then the next one moves maybe to an HB level pencil. And then finally you get to the last one, which is maybe a 2H type pencil. So I can try and do those by hand with just a regular Ticonderoga HB2 pencil that I have here. But what those might look like if you have your drawing pencils, I'm going to get mine lined up. I happen to have a 6B, a 2B, an HB, and a 4H on mine. So if I looked at that compared to the 6B is a little darker when I push fully and hard with it, but not as much. And then I'm going to move down over to a 2B. So if I push really hard with my 2B, that's all the darker it's going to get. Move into my HB, which is a little bit lighter than my 2B because I've moved down a couple. And then I have a 4H. When I color really hard with that 4H, that's all the darker that it's going to get. So we can still get those gradations between the different pencils. Again, how hard you push and how light you push, or how gentle you are, determines how much is going to come off onto your paper, no matter what level that you're working with. So when we're working with our origami and we have a really hard edge shadow someplace, you need to make sure that it's staying nice and dark. I'm going to throw a few extra papers under mine because I'm getting the roughness of my table on here and I don't want that. So I want to keep it really smooth, so find a smooth surface to work on, right? And if it fades out, and you have to pay attention to your lighting source, right? So if it's fading out, you would get more gentle as you move across your paper. You might work back and forth a little bit because you don't want a hard solid line. You want these to blend nicely. The other way you can work on those blending nicely is you can do them in circles as you go across, that scumbling technique, which helps it to stay a little smoother and a little bit nicer. Now you can always go back in with your finger, start with the darkest side, work your way over. You can see it drags that graphite across your paper a decent distance when you're doing that. This works better if your fingers are a little damp, if you have a little natural sweat on there, because the more graphite you load up on here, the more it's going to keep pushing it someplace else, and eventually it won't pick up anymore because it'll be too smooth. And then you can go back in with your eraser and you can sharpen those edges again. If it's not smooth enough for you in between, you can always add more. If you move too much out of the way, you're getting too hard of a line, go back in, and then you can smooth some more. If you don't like smoothing with your finger, you can also do it with a Q-tip or a cotton swab or a piece of paper towel or something wrapped around your finger. But again, if you want to get those nice hard edges, because origami is folded, so it'll have some harder edges where all of a sudden it turns white, go back in and you can erase those out and you can get those nicely defined edges in your origami work. Some sections will be a fold that's completely in a shadow, so you need to make sure that that area is totally colored in. It might not fade out gradually, and you have to pay attention to that when you're working with your different origami photos that you took. Whereas it might have a little drop shadow underneath that does fade out, right? Something like that. Or you could have a sheet of paper that's fully in the light, but then underneath is where you're going to have the cast shadow that's being blocked by your paper. And if it fades out, you'll have to determine that, or sometimes they're even really hard edges and it's straight dark all the way through. And the easiest way to compare, are you getting dark enough with your pencil for your shadows, is to take this paper and put it right next to your reference photo if that's on your iPad or if you printed it out off of a black and white printer. But hold it right next to it to look at it and see if you can figure out if you have it dark enough. Sometimes it's still a really dark shadow, and then you could have the edge of your paper, right, or it's super dark, but then this is still blocked a little bit by the light. So you may have a shadow, a real deep shadow, and then a much lighter shadow underneath something. Again, all of this is going to depend on what yours looks like, but you can always go back through, smooth things out. That's what's going to give it a lot of that hyper realism when you're doing it, is smoothing it out with your finger and then going back and erasing those sharp edges in there. So don't be afraid to smooth with your finger. You can start accidentally leaving fingerprints, as you can see, all over your paper if you're not careful, so you might also want to have a damp towel nearby to keep wiping your finger off. But blending with your finger, making sure your edges are sharp, going back and erasing anything that shouldn't be there to keep those white spaces white.